My name is Emily Houston, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ashland Center for Nonviolence, and we are very happy to work in conjunction with several organizations that are putting this event on. And you'll get to hear from them later throughout the program. I'd like to say a word of prayer before we get started. And dear Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to gather together, to learn, to be challenged. Lord, we ask that you would give us ears to hear, and that any preconceived notions that we have, that we'll put those to the side and listen with open hearts and open minds to tonight's program. In your name, amen. The video, it's my pleasure to introduce Terrie Bonfiglio, an Ashlander who's going to join us this evening and share her personal story. Welcome, Terrie.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good evening. As you know, I'm from Ashland, and I was asked to come and present my ideas for why I am against the death penalty here in Ohio. And I want to give you a little bit of background first so that you could understand how I came to that conclusion. I was born to an unwed mother and was adopted when I was 6 weeks of age. That's going to come into play here in a little bit, but I don't want to sidetrack us too much. So when you look at the family members that I had and how I grew up here in Ashland, the 7 years that my parents waited to hold me and have me, they had been praying for a baby all this time. And so they bring us to the family, and the family consists of a policeman, Ashland City policeman, a sheriff's department patrolman, and then my dad was a Navy veteran, and I had an uncle who was also a colonel in the Air Force. So needless to say, that was a very, did I mention we were Catholic, and I went to Catholic school for 8 years. So needless to say, a very conservative family. And so growing up like that, it wasn't really discussed that the death penalty was wrong. We were allowed, or it was accepted, that the death penalty was there as one, a deterrent, and two, to bring swift and equal justice so there would be closure for the families of victims. Well, I'm here to tell you tonight that that's a fallacy. Neither of those two things are working. And I think that when the death penalty was brought about and we were led to believe that this was a good thing, perhaps that was a topic for another discussion as to why that was brought about. But I had another uncle who was savagely murdered in Tampa, Florida. That happened in the year 2000. So you might think that with the conservative background and with that happening to our family, that obviously, of course, I would be for the death penalty. And, where's the plug? Let me plug Sparky in. Well, the raw truth of it is that because of the delays, because of all of the things that I saw my aunt and all my cousins go through, I'm like, there has got to be a better way. And this happened in Florida. In Florida, when you do a murder trial, it has to be a unanimous consent of the jury. And this is going to come into play of what I tell you too. But there was one juror who said no. So that meant all the years that my aunt and my cousin spent going to all of the different trial things, and there were many. There were times when they would get there and it would be delayed for several months. This just went on. And every time that happened, those wounds were reopened. Okay. So again, I'm thinking about it and just kind of living life. I was a pharmaceutical rep for 17 years on the road. I do not have children. I have dogs. So, being a dog mom. And then this odd thing called COVID hit. Okay. And now, boom, I'm at home. I'm in my yard. I had a lot of time to talk to God. and have some really serious conversations about why things were the way they were. And I prayed that, like, hey, show me some things here. Like, show me where this whole thing with the death penalty is going. And God did that in a very unusual way. I became much more active on the pro-life side of things. And I'm sitting in my garden, literally, one afternoon, and I'm like, wait a minute. You cannot be all in for, like, no abortion, pro-life over here on this end of life. And on this end of life, where you have someone who's done something wrong and clearly needs to pay for it, but be okay with them dying and being the one. And then more weeds and more time with God. I thought, this is crazy. Do we think about the peripheral damage that happens when we allow someone to be killed with the death penalty? You have the person that's either plugging the machine in, doing the injection, all of the courts, all the people, again, all of the time and tribulation, the families and the victims. And so another eureka moment, I was like, hey, what if God has put me in a position to pull some of the, like, really strange pieces together? And it occurred to me that I'd had interaction over at Braintree Business Development Center in Mansfield, Ohio, with an entrepreneur who had, in fact, created a product to help prisoners. And it was there that I learned that 20% of the prison population will never recidivistate. They'll go out and be reintegrated into society, and they will do a tremendous job. And then, sadly, 20% probably should never see the light of day. They could cause more harm. And so, of course, having the experience of my uncle, I agreed with that figure. And it occurred to me that the 40% in the middle is perhaps who God in my garden was trying to tell me about. Like, what could I do to help them? Okay. And so being led to a place of having to make a decision of what side of the fence you were going to land on, I decided at that moment that even if it meant people were going to disagree with me, that I was going to stand up for absolute life on the beginning of things and on the end over here. And that, of course, includes, our healthy people at the end as well. But for prisoners, I decided that I was going to try to take a stand. And so I started to try to get educated about the figures that we were doing. And this is when God brought forth I'm, believe it or not, a trained economist. So my degree is actually in ag econ. And so it occurred to me, and then when you guys came to present to us, that, oh my gosh, so I already don't think that we should be killing someone, well, because God said so, with, I think it's rule number 5, okay, the commandments, right? But also because when you start looking at the costs, you really have a hard time justifying how we're using so much taxpayer money. And I'm telling you, my eyes were wide open, because I never would have dreamed that when you're starting, the initial trials are about the same cost. But then when someone is sentenced to death, you now have taken 3 to 6 times the amount of money to put them away or put them on death row. Now I'm going to leave it to the other speakers to tell you exactly how much money that is. But what God spoke to me in my garden about was that if we were successful, if we could go out there and show other people, either from a religious aspect, I know not everyone sits in their garden and talks to God like I do. So maybe that's not the way to reach them. But if they're interested in how much money we could be saving as taxpayers, perhaps they would get the idea, like I did, that what if we had no death penalty and we took all that money? So think about it, 130 times, say 3 million, that's a little bit start of some money, right? And what if we took that and we actually did more as a country, perhaps like Germany, to reintegrate prisoners back into our society. What if we took some of that money and, just as I saw nothing happen for my uncle's wife and family members, what if we used some of that money to actually get them the counseling that would help them to actually close their wounds? So that is kind of where I'm from. I'm a fiscal conservative, and but I believe that first and foremost, God does not want us killing each other. There's got to be a better way. And in Germany, as I understand it, they really do quite a bit outside of the prisons to try to reintegrate folks. So that's it. That's my story.
Thank you, Terrie. Now I'd like to welcome up Reverend Demetrius Minor, who's going to give us a theological perspective on.
Thank you, Terrie, for sharing your story, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm actually from Dayton, Ohio, and I've been a conservative for many years, and I had always considered myself to be pro-life, but as a default position, I find myself supporting the death penalty. I really couldn't give you a concrete reason why. It was just something that was expected out of me until roughly 2010 or so. My pastor at the time, in casual conversation, said that it's impossible to be pro-life and simultaneously pro-death. And that's when I began to do a moral reevaluation of where I personally stood. And for me, I said, there has to be consistency within my pro-life views. And if I'm going to be pro-life, I have to be pro-life all the way. And so for many Christians, the Bible can be read and interpreted in various ways when it comes to the death penalty. While we do acknowledge these differences, it would be spiritually negligent to determine policies of life and death when we're not in total full agreement. Romans 5:8 tells us this: but God showed his love for us while we were still sinners. Christ died for us. It is imperative that we remember and acknowledge that Christ died for all of humanity, and that includes those who commit the most heinous of crimes. The power of Christianity is that there is access to redemption and restoration. We cannot determine in our finite wisdom when God is done working on someone's heart, or when the expiration date has arrived for that particular individual's life. It's very tempting to rank sins and to deem one sin as greater than the other. But the Bible tells us that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, and that God does not show favoritism. So with that said, I'm not in a position to condemn another sinner or judge their sinful act simply because it's different than the sins that I have committed. Matthew 7 tells us, judge not that ye be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and there's a log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So the scripture gives us several examples of those who committed murder, who went on to do great things for the kingdom of God. Example number one, Moses. Moses went from being a murderer to leading the children of Israel out of bondage and captivity and towards the promised land. Example number two, my personal favorite Bible character, David. David went from being an adulterer and murderer to being what the Bible describes as a man after God's own heart, and authoring the book of Psalms one of the most quoted books of the Bible. Saul went from being a murderer to being renamed Paul, and he's a writer of a third of the New Testament. The new covenant means that old laws have fallen away and being fulfilled by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Sins are now covered by the grace in his blood sacrifice and no longer requires human sacrifice. So if we are to bear the title of Christian, this means we must emulate Christ in all of his ways and not just the ways that are the most appealing to us. We must exude grace and mercy and advocate for healing and restoration, not punishment. And as we all just celebrated this Easter season, I ask that we all continue to be ambassadors of this message, and that is that reconciliation and redemption is available for all of mankind. Thank you, guys. Yes.
Thank you, Demetrius. Really appreciate you bringing that word forward. Now it's my personal pleasure to invite Gail Rice, who comes all the way from Colorado.
No, Chicago.
Chicago. Oh, that's right.
I came from the campaign in Colorado.
Okay, very good. Okay. I knew Colorado's in there somehow. But come on up here, Gail. We look forward to hearing from you.
I'm Gail Vanderjagt Rice, the sister of Bruce Vanderjagt. Bruce was a Denver police officer who was killed in the line of duty by a skinhead on November 12th, 1997, who later committed suicide with my brother's service revolver. I take Bruce and his family with me sometimes when I'm speaking. Bruce, you can pass it around. Bruce left behind a wife, Anna, and his 2.5-year-old daughter, Haley, the joys of his life. It was a very devastating experience for all of us. I want to make it clear that I do believe in stricter penalties for people who kill law enforcement officers, but for me, that would be life without parole. I don't want to see anybody killed by the death penalty. Perhaps one thing that distinguishes me from a lot of crime victims is that I've spent so many years working in jail and prison inmates and found the experience very, very satisfying. As an adult literacy specialist who has always been fascinated by the criminal justice system, I've had 18 years of volunteer experience in jails and prisons at the time that Bruce was killed. I've done several years of work with Chuck Colson's Prison Fellowship Ministries, but I'd also worked as a literacy tutor weekly in Chicago's Cook County Jail, and I am there in present time too, so it's been about 41 years now. I cared very much for the men and the women that I worked for in Cook County Jail and in prisons, and was very upset at the way that offenders are often seen by the society at large. I'm grateful that Bruce's murder did not in any way take away my passion for working with inmates. At that time of Bruce's murder and before, I'd had so much experience in jails and prisons that I saw such a difference in fairness for the rich and for the poor that I believed that the death penalty was wrong because I didn't believe there was any fair way to carry it out in the situation. 1 year after Bruce's murder, I discovered the group Murder Victims Families for Reconciliation. That's a group that opposed the death penalty that was made up of murder victim family members like myself, and also family members of those who were on death row or who had been executed. That group really changed my opinion of the death penalty, so much so that opposed it for a whole lot more reasons than unfairness of the system. The biggest reason for my opposition to the death penalty is that I feel it completely violates my Christian faith and principles.
Yes.
I believe that our view of the death penalty is primarily determined by what we feel about offenders. What are they like as far as people are concerned? And I've never heard it said better, so I'm going to quote Sister Helen Prejean, who wrote the book Dead Man Walking and has written other books and has done more, I think, in the United States to abolish the death penalty. When she was very famous and the movie was out and won Oscars and so on, she appeared on a Frontline program called Angel on Death Row. And this is what she said that I want to quote, execution is the opposite of baptism into a community. Baptism into a community means that we are all connected. We are all one family and you are all part of us. An execution is removing a person from the human family step by step, saying, you are no longer a part of us. You are not human like we are, and so we can terminate you. That's the end of the quote. If we look at murder suspects as useless scum, then we really don't have the incentive to ensure them a fair trial, or to make sure that they really are guilty of the crime that they're accused of, or after their conviction to worry much about their lives. And so we can give our blessing to the death penalty. And then if the death penalty is carried out, why should we worry if it's torturous for them? After all, they've tortured their victims. Maybe we should give some of it back to them. God help us, I say. If I deny a death row inmate's humanity or set aside that person's worth, then I'm adopting an attitude that is not very different from the attitude that my killer had when he killed my brother. He certainly didn't value Bruce's life. And because the death penalty is especially unfair to the poor and minorities, it makes a mockery of God's preferential caring for the powerless and the most vulnerable that the Bible is always talking about. The death penalty cuts off the possibility of forgiveness, reconciliation, and redemption that Christ always wants me to work toward. It is a violent act of retribution and revenge. As a Christian, how can I accept those attitudes? I can't. If we as Christians want to be known as pro-life, we must be pro-life for everyone. Right. Another reason I oppose the death penalty is that it sometimes convicts and later even kills innocent people. Fortunately, some of those wrongly convicted people get exonerated before they get executed. Since 1973, over 185 people have been released from death row after they have been proven innocent. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of factors that contribute to wrongful convictions. Racial prejudice, police and prosecutorial misconduct, botched crime scenes, incompetent defense counsel, especially, shoddy forensics, testimony that is false or perjured or coerced. In several cases, people are exonerated not because of our legal system, but in spite of it, when people outside the system start examining the cases that police and prosecutors have been finished with. As the sister of a police officer, I get outraged when I hear of police and prosecutors who knowingly participate in wrongful convictions. And that was in fact the case with Randy Steidel. Randy Steidel is an exonerated Illinois inmate that I knew the best, that I know the best of exonerated inmates. I've met several. And the man whom I worked closely with in Illinois' repeal campaign. Exonerations were a crucial factor in Illinois' campaign because Illinois was the second worst as far as exonerations. Illinois has exonerated 21 people from death row. The only state that is worse than Illinois is Florida, with 30 exonerations. Randy was inmate number 18 of the 21. He spent 17 years in prison, including 12 of them on death row. Randy's conviction was overturned when he was released in 2004 because there was evidence of not only poor legal representation, but fabricated testimony of him due to police misconduct, and local law enforcement and prosecutors actively framing him. If you get to know any exonerated death row inmates, I assure you, you will experience the injustice of the death penalty in a new way. Exonerated inmates are some of the most critical and powerful voices to speak against the death penalty today. An average of 4 wrongly convicted death row prisoners have been exonerated every year since 1973. Texas has the 3rd worst exoneration rate with 16, followed by North Carolina with 12. But then Ohio is tied with Louisiana and Arizona for 5th place with 11 exonerations. 11 exonerations is really bad. Ohio currently has 135 people on death row. Now, the National Academy of Science estimates that about 4.1% of those on death row are likely to be exonerated. So there might be 5 or 6 innocent inmates on Ohio's death row right now. We don't know. I pray that if that is the case, they will all be exonerated. There are a lot of other reasons to oppose the death penalty. Here are some of them. There is no credible evidence that the death penalty is any deterrent to serious crime. It has always been carried out with extreme racial prejudice. As Terrie said, it is far, far more expensive than life without parole sentences or any other kind of punishments. Death penalty methods are cruel and inhuman punishment. The death penalty also diminishes the respect that the United States is given in this world just by doing it. But I'd like to elaborate on another reason that affects me more personally. For much of my death penalty work, which began in 1999 to repeal Illinois' death penalty and continued until 2020, just before the pandemic broke out, to repeal Colorado's death penalty, I've worked with murder victim family members like myself. Like exonerated death row inmates, murder victims' family members are powerful voices in the death penalty debate. Many prosecutors and politicians just assume that, of course, we're going to favor the death penalty. In fact, they're quite shocked when they find out that several of us oppose the death penalty. I oppose the death penalty because it hurts rather than heals murder victim family members who have already suffered so much. As Terrie said, in every capital case, victims' family members will themselves be sentenced to many years, maybe a decade, maybe 2 decades, maybe even more than 2 decades, to repeatedly relive the details of the crime as appeals and legal challenges wind their way through the courts. In Illinois, Governor George Ryan had first approved of the death penalty as a legislator, but his excellent journalism from the Chicago Tribune and excellent lawyering from some people in Illinois showed what Illinois' death penalty was like. Ryan began to rethink his position. Illinois was the first state to put a moratorium on the death penalty, and no state has worked harder to make the death penalty fair than Illinois. In 2002, Governor Ryan's bipartisan Commission on Capital Punishment released a report that recommended 85 reforms to the capital punishment system. But it concluded that no system could be devised that would guarantee that an innocent person wouldn't be put to death. I was certain that even if we had the money to enact all those reforms, we would not have the political or moral will to do so. And Governor Ryan was dismayed that the legislature enacted only a small number of reforms. He finally concluded that the death penalty was indeed too flawed to fix. We used that as a slogan of the Illinois campaign, too flawed to fix. The scene that haunts me the most about the death penalty and family members occurred in 2002, when Governor Ryan was considering commuting the sentences of all 167 inmates on Illinois' death row because so many innocent people had been exonerated. He eventually did commute those sentences, but just before that, the Prisoner Review Board held hearings on each of those death row inmates and invited family members to speak. I will never forget one woman, victim's family member, who screamed at the defendant's lawyers, "I've been waiting 23 years for this, and now one governor with the stroke of a pen is going to take it away from me." I looked at that woman and I felt heartsick for her and others like her who had been hanging on, desperate for decades, to the lie that an execution was the only path to peace and closure. If the person who killed her loved one could have been sentenced instead to life without parole, she could have left the courtroom on that day and gone on with her life. That would have brought her much more peace and closure. In my 23 years of abolition work, I've met many murder victim family members. Some have witnessed the executioners of the killers of their loved ones. I've never heard one of those people say, "I'm so glad that execution took place. Now I have closure. I'm finally at peace." No. Instead, they lament the whole death penalty process that has caused them so much pain and misery. The idea that executions help or heal victims' family members is, as you said, an absolute lie. What helps them will be to repeal the death penalty. I'm very grateful to be here tonight to speak with Equal Justices USA Evangelical Network and their conservatives concerned about the death penalty network, with Ohioans to Stop Executions, and with Ashland Center for Nonviolence. I hope some of the things I said might motivate you to join in our efforts or give you some encouragement to help those who are involved with the effort. And so I'll just end with some advice that I hope will be helpful. When we discuss things like murder, things can get very, very polarized, and people, especially co-victims or the victim family members, may react strongly and even hatefully. Their attitude may be something like, "Hey, you are either with the murderer or you're with the victims. If you oppose the death penalty, then you're with the murderer, and we victims don't want anything to do with you." That is just plain wrong, and no co-victim ever needs to make that kind of choice. It's one reason why I'm glad I had the experience with prisoners that I did have before Bruce's murder. I say to those people, I don't experience any contradiction or any problems about being concerned with both the murderer and the victim. That is Jesus Christ inside me, wanting me to respond that way. It shows that everyone has value. However, it is certainly true that the death penalty divides families and friends when they need each other the most. Many people involved in repeal are rejected and sometimes even disowned by their families. That's a really stiff price to pay. And so it's important that you have supportive people, if you were going through something like this, around you to help you through disappointments and rejections like this. If you don't take care of yourself with help from others, you can really burn out in this effort. I think it's very important that you listen to and organize two groups with very powerful voices in this effort. Those two groups are the co-victims, the murder victim family members that oppose the death penalty, and also exonerated inmates who have suffered from their time on death row. These two groups were organized and were very, very influential in the campaign in Illinois, and the murder victims' family members were also very influential in Colorado's campaign. We couldn't have succeeded in either of those campaigns without them. When we're speaking of lobbying, which is usually the end result, it can be very discouraging when you're unsuccessful again and again in this effort. And that's why you need a supportive group around you to encourage you. At those times, my advice is persistence is the only way to success. When your campaigns are persistent and you're returning to the legislatures again and again, if you're involved in lobbying, The death penalty as an issue becomes much more well-known in Ohio, and the legislators become more aware of it. The legislators realize that you aren't going to go away and you're not going to give up. And if you don't get it done in that current legislative session, you'll be back for the next legislative session. And with each effort, you'll likely be convincing more of the legislators and more of the public. I will be very happily praying for you as you move ahead with this effort in Ohio. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gail. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Rebecca Simpson, who's going to share about legislation that's currently working its way through both houses of our General Assembly here in Ohio, and also share with us ways that we can be involved.
Good evening. I'm Rebecca, and I am Ohioans to Stop Executions Conservative Outreach Coordinator. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about the two bills that are currently pending in the Ohio Legislature, the Ohio General Assembly, to end the death penalty, and then talk about a little bit about how you can get involved or how you can learn more if your interest has been tweaked and you want to do either of those things. So there are two bills, one in the House, one in the Senate. The one in the House is House Bill 183. The one in the Senate is Senate Bill 103. The one in the House has had 5 hearings and it's probably time for a vote in the House committee. Now, I'm sure you all know, this is an election year for all of the House and half of the Senate. So that keeps the General Assembly very busy. And I'm sure you've been reading about that they're even busier this year because of all of the confusion about the redistricting and how it keeps getting overturned. And some people don't know what districts they're running in. So right now the focus is unfortunately not on lawmaking, but it's understandable with all that's going on. So we may not see a vote until after the primary in the House committee, or we may not see a vote until lame duck. Same in the Senate. In the Senate, we've had 2 hearings. We anticipate that we probably won't have any hearings until at least after the primary, maybe not until after the general election. So we are all getting ready for lame duck, which is, as you know, starts right after the general election, because we believe that's when the legislature is going to start moving things, which is both discouraging and encouraging. It would be great if we could get it passed to the committee during the year, but it also gives us time. Right now, we're feeling comfortable with the vote count in the Senate. In the House, we need to get some more votes. So that gives us some time to, for us to talk with legislators. It gives us time to talk with constituents, to talk with their legislators. And that's what I wanted to talk with you about, because one of the most influential ways to let your legislator know what you're thinking on an issue and to maybe change their mind on an issue is to talk to them. So probably the best way is if you have a personal relationship with your legislator and can sit down and have coffee and explain your position and where you are and what you're thinking, that's terrific. But even if you don't have a relationship with your legislator, there are lots of things that you can do to get involved. And we would love to talk with you about getting involved. So you can write letters to the editor, you can write op-eds, you can call your legislator, you can email your legislator, you can come to events, you can volunteer for phone making. There's all kinds of things that you can do. So what I want to do tonight is let you know how you can either contact us and learn more, or contact us and let us know that you want to get involved. So I'm going to give you, and I don't know if anyone has any way to write things down, but I'll give you now, and then I'll put at the end of the event a sign-up sheet in back. And so you can sign up and give me your email and your name, and we can contact you. If you want to write a note, want to help out, want to learn more, then we'll know what you're interested in. But my cell, if anyone wants it, is 513-703-6227, and I'm happy to answer any questions, because we've gone over a lot of information tonight, a lot of different topics about why people may be opposed to the death penalty, and you may have questions, and we're always happy to answer questions. And then my email is Rebecca, REBECCA, it's OTSE, we call it OTSE, Ohioans to Stop Executions, OTSE.org. And then our website, if you go to our website, which is www.otse.org, you'll see a button that says join. And so you can join there as well, and you'll get on our email list that way. But if you have questions or want to volunteer, please email me or please sign up on the sheet in the back that I've left in my car, so I'm going to run out and get as soon as this is over. So bear with me for just a minute when it's over, and we'd be happy to connect with you. Thanks so much for coming today. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you all for coming tonight to learn and to be challenged by the different presentations here and to listen and wrestle with them. Many arguments and the bipartisan push that's behind this movement to abolish this penalty here in Ohio. If you'd like to stay and stick around and talk with our presenters, that'd be great. And of course, if you want to be involved in advocacy, please do that. Thank you.